Well, yeah, I'm supposed to be talking to you about food as medicine, and I usually find out that most people want to hear this particular story of my own odyssey in preserving my life, as they say, which started 6 years ago in 1999. And usually when I address a group like this, I usually participate by asking for participation from the audience if it so pleases you. And so what I would like to do is take a poll or a survey, and I'll ask maybe 3 or 4 questions, and as those of you who raise your hands, do raise your hands, if you could keep them elevated until the questions are over, it might give us all some sense of where we're at as a community and as a species. So the first question is, how many folks in this room have either had or currently have cancer? Okay, keep the hands up, please. Thank you. And keep them up. And second question is, how many people in this room have had significant others with cancer, namely spouses, children, parents, brothers and sisters? Okay, so keep them up. And then third question is, how about extended family, which includes grandparents, grandchildren, nephews, nieces, uncles, aunts? All right, and then last but not least, close friends. Close friends. So you look around the room, and this is where we've come so far. I'll give you a little, I think, overview. I think what people need is an overview as to where this cancer industry has taken us. And for that matter, the modern medical machine has taken us. I don't have any quarrel or any malcontent or discontentedness with modern medicine for what it's remarkably able to do. You fall out of a tree or you're in a bad car wreck, it's pretty astounding what modern medicine can do in terms of piecing you back together. I've got nothing but compliments and praise for the kinds of things that modern medicine has achieved with regard to acute medicine and trauma. But when it comes to chronic or degenerative illnesses, it's been a major fiasco. And that's because chronic illness and degenerative illnesses have nothing to do with the deficiency of heroic medicine. It has to do with the fact that our environment is going down the tubes. It has to do with the fact that the construct of health is being lost. A lot of it already has been lost. And that until you start recognizing the cause behind the cause behind the cause, there isn't anything that heroic medicine can do to reconcile this major, major problem that we have in Western industrial cultures. When I was coming back a year ago from California, I was at the Western Organic Dairy Conference, the first annual Western Organic Dairy Conference. And my plane got stranded because of weather and other issues in Washington, D.C. before I flew back to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So I had some time to kill, and I was walking around, and I ended up picking up a magazine called Fortune Magazine. How many people have heard of Fortune Magazine? It's a very conventional financial advisory magazine. I don't subscribe to it. The only reason why I picked it up was because it had a front page feature article in there called Why We're Losing the War on Cancer. And I thought, well, this ought to be interesting. Why are we losing the war on cancer? And in the process of reading the article in depth, it never really addressed what my conclusions have been and currently are as to why we have cancer and why we're losing the war on cancer, which is environmental assaults and insults, nutritional deficiencies, nutritional antagonists, stress, lifestyle, those kinds of things. It only dealt with the modern medical model of oncology in our conventional oncology wards. So they interviewed people, prestigious oncologists, in Sloan Memorial Kettering in New York City, in MD Anderson in Texas, a few other places. And what was interesting about that article was they were talking about the history of the war on cancer, quote unquote, which was actually initiated by President Richard Nixon around 1972. So we're talking about a 30-year war, quote unquote, on cancer. Well, first of all, anytime the United States declares war on something domestic, it's a disaster. The war on drugs, the war on poverty, all these things have been major fiascos in the United States. So when you deal with the war on cancer, what is the war on cancer? Well, they decided to ear tag all this funding for research. And in that last 30 some odd years, we have amassed $200 billion worth of research for cancer. And what was amazing with the graphs that you saw in this article was that the 4 main cancer killers in the United States, which are lung cancer, prostate cancer, breast cancer, and colorectal cancer, once that cancer has metastasized, which it invariably does, metastasis means it spreads from the primary tumor to distant locations like the liver or the bone or the brain. In that whole 30-some years with $200 billion, and by the way, there was 1.56 million medical papers published on research on cancer in this time. Not 1.56 thousand, 1.56 million research papers. There hasn't been one iota, scintilla of progress on the 4 major killers of cancer in the United States. And yet, we unraveled the human genome in 18 years. We put a man on the moon after the space program was officiated in 9 years. We developed an atomic weapon in 17 months under the Manhattan Project during World War II, before we were even sure what atomic energy was. In 17 months. And yet $200 billion $200 billion later, and 30-some years later, we've got zip on improvement on the 4 major cancer killers in the United States. This year in the United States, we will have 1.3 million people diagnosed with cancer, and we will have 600,000 of us die of cancer, about half. There's more people now that make their living in the cancer industry than that die from cancer in the United States. So it's turned into this massive industry, and the whole basis of this article was when they talked to the oncologists, who were quite apparently disgusted and frustrated. It was predicated on the fact that the model, as they call it, stinks. And that's a quote. The model stinks. And what's the model? The model is that the drug companies, the pharmaceutical companies that come out with these promising new drugs that you read about in the Wall Street Journal that start inching the stock of that particular company up because there's some promising new breakthrough in the cancer issue. They're all predicated on the fact that you can shrink a laboratory mouse's tumor by 10%, basically. And yet, as the article pointed out, tumors don't kill cancer patients. Metastatic illness kills cancer patients when it spreads from the breast and ends up going to the brain or the lungs or the liver or the bones. So that being said, it's like, well, what is that predicated on? Well, it's predicated on the fact that they now know that metastasis kills about 90% of cancer patients, and also 50% of cancer patients die of a condition known as cachexia, wasting disease. They have nothing for metastasis, and you know why? Because there's one thing that does check metastasis, and that's strong immunity. And drugs don't impart strong immunity. That's what keeps us from coming apart at the seams every single day. Everybody in this room right now is dealing with an immune system that is doing something remarkably and amazingly profound. And that is, they've unraveled how the cancer genes work, how the genes that turn off cancer work, how the ones that turn on cancer work at the cellular level. And what they've discovered is that in a human, the gene defects, 90% of them are corrected in 24 hours in human species. In other species, that doesn't work that way. In a laboratory rat, it's 0 to 13% in 24 hours. So we have this special ability to fix what's broken, even malignancies, within 24 hours based on what? Based on how the body understands how to turn things on, turn it off, and how to keep the immune system on full alert so that any metastasis that leaves the site of the primary tumor has a chance of being contained. Now, not too long before this article came out, I happened to watch a public television program one night. In the United States, it's called NOVA, N-O-V-A. And in that article was on cancer. And I was surprised at how blunt and honest this article on the television set was about cancer. Some of these things I already knew. For example, that the warfare that they're using on cancer patients right now, namely chemotherapy, are derivatives or daughter products of mustard gas from World War I warfare. How many people knew that? Yeah, not a lot of people know that that's still the technology. World War I mustard gas technology is what they primarily, this is in the NOVA article. What the other thing was they found out is that there is this phenomena known as angiogenesis. And what angiogenesis is that if you have a malignancy, that malignancy needs to do what other cells do, which is what? Be nourished. And how is it nourished? The same way the healthy cells are nourished, with blood vessels. And what the malignancy does, and cancer is a very, very uncanny character. It sends out biochemical messages in the body so that blood vessels will grow to the malignancies that are the primary tumor and also all the other tumors that this cancer has now seeded throughout the body. What's interesting about this is that if 90% of the gene defects are corrected in 24 hours in a healthy individual, by the time you get a diagnosis of cancer, and that tumor could be the size of a grape, size of a grape that's got 1 billion dividing cells, rapidly dividing cells, that eventually are going to send seeds all over the place. And what contains those seeds from completely devouring you in short order is the immune system, and the second thing is the enviable nature of the primary tumor. Now that's a peculiar thing. The primary tumor wants you all to itself. And so these other seeds that are in your body are actually suppressed because the immune system is working, hopefully, and secondly because the primary tumor, which of course is secreting specific angiogenic chemicals or biochemicals to build blood vessels to itself, is also secreting anti-angiogenic substances for the rest of the gang. So that is why Dr. Judah Volkmann, the man who discovered angiogenesis back in the 1960s when he was a Navy doctor in the US Navy, and presented this theory to his colleagues and was ridiculed and villainized in the medical literature, was on this program, NOVA, and that's when he came to the conclusion that's why when a primary tumor is extracted, oftentimes the cancer gets worse. Because now the anti-angiogenic compounds that the primary tumor was secreting have been removed, and now the smaller seeds that are everywhere have the ability to produce their own angiogenic substances to have blood vessels built to them, and then it starts to grow. What I found out also is that this whole phenomena of cancer, it's predicated on the fact that if you're dying of cachexia, 50% of the patients are dying of cachexia. What does that really mean? I mean, what is cachexia? Wasting disease. You see it with HIV patients as well, but with cancer, it works on a very specific principle. And the principle is that malignant cells thrive on glucose, which is sugar. It's one of the reasons why it's extremely important, if you have cancer and you don't want to get cancer as well as other illnesses, to cut out the sugar. And that's a tough thing to do, because sugar is the most addictive substance in Western society. More addictive than tobacco, more addictive than alcohol, more addictive, I'll have you know, than cocaine. In 1820, Americans were consuming between 10 and 20 pounds per year of sugar. In 2004, we were consuming 175 pounds of sugar per capita per year. 175 pounds per capita per year. Now, think about this. It's not coincidental that cancer cells have up to 15 times more the insulin receptor sites that healthy cells have. What does insulin do? Delivers sugar to the cell. So they have up to 15 times more insulin receptor sites on the cell membrane, cancer cells do, than healthy cells do. They're thirsty, addicted to sugar. And insulin is the delivery mechanism for sugar. And the other thing that cancer cells do is they secrete certain enzymes that create insulin resistance on the healthy cells, which is what diabetics go through, right? Isn't that one of the things that diabetics suffer from, is insulin resistance? The sugar can't get out of the bloodstream and get into the cell. That's insulin resistance. So it secretes compounds that create insulin resistance with the healthy cells. Why? Well, on the one hand, it's got maybe 15 more doors to open up to let the sugar come in. And meanwhile, it's creating insulin resistance for the healthy cells, so the sugar can't get in. And this is why we start having this problem with people really starting to go down the tubes in a hurry. In my opinion, when you start giving them what in the hospital on IV? Glucose. Glucose. When you should be giving them some kind of fatty acid, not glucose, because healthy cells can live on fatty acids. And there's also things that you can take that will alleviate insulin resistance, things as common as cinnamon. Cinnamon is one of the most powerful. There's a compound in cinnamon called sinulin that actually does a remarkable job with diabetics. It almost acts like insulin. It's so effective in lessening insulin resistance for diabetics. Anyway, it just goes to show you that there's a lot of things that could be done that are being ignored. And this whole sugar thing, you know, I have relatives that live in Italy. My ancestors are from Italy. My grandparents all farmed in Italy. And so I had cousins that came over from there in 1997. And they were big fans of music, and we have a big music festival in this town called Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, not too far from where I live, and it was founded by the Moravian Germans, so the theme is somewhat German in terms of the names of the city blocks that they cordon off where there's simultaneous music events, and you can hear everything from jazz to folk to classical to whatever you want. And we were walking from one Platz to another Platz, and in transit we went through an area that was playing polka music. It was a big polka tent. And there was all these polka-type foods there, like the fried dough and the shoe fly pie and, you know, those kinds of rich Germanic foods. And as we were walking through that area to go to this other area, my cousin's wife tapped me on the arm and said, "Jerry, cosa ci hanno sta gente?" What's wrong with these people? I answered, "Perché? Why?" She said, "Sono tutte molto grasse." They are so huge. They don't see people that big over there, and they don't see that many people that big over there. And you know, and it occurred to me when she said that I was becoming oblivious to it, because we are the obese country of the world now, the United States. Now, this diabetic thing is all tied into this, and this whole food industry The crap that we eat is all tied in with this thing. That's why food is medicine. What kind of food? Not the food we eat. And if you look at the food we eat and you talk about the fact that in the published literature, the medical literature, of the babies that were born in the year 2000, which means the current 4 and 5-year-olds, 35% of those kids are going to become adult onset diabetics. And with the Hispanic population, it's 52% of the boys and something like 48% of the 52% of the girls and about 48% of the boys. Half, 1 out of 2, over 1 out of 3 of the rest of the population. Does anybody realize the implications in the next 15, 20 years? Because when you're 40 and you're a diabetic at that point, if you're a male, your lifespan is shortened by 12 years. If you're a female, it's up to 19 years shorter as a diabetic because so many things are associated with diabetes. It's the #1 cause of blindness. It's the #1 reason for limb amputations. It's the #1 reason for kidney failure. It's the #1 reason for male impotence over the age of 50. But we've got medical solutions for all those, don't we? We've got prosthesis for legs that are cut off. We've got dialysis units or clinics for kidneys that have failed. We've got laser therapy for blindness. And we've got Viagra for impotence. That's what we have. This is our solution to a situation that's all based on the fact that the food system is incredibly broken. In 1946, we used to consume 10 gallons of soft drinks per capita per year. And in 2004, we're now consuming, in the United States, 55 gallons of soft drinks per capita per year. Now that means somebody out there is drinking 110, maybe 150 gallons of soft drinks here, because I drink none. That's the average. You know what they say about averages? You have one foot on dry ice, the other foot in scalding water, you're comfortable. You know? And yet in the meantime, you've got Merck Sharp and Dohme, the largest drug company in the world, that just now admitted that their drug Vioxx, killed 55,000 Americans from side effects. And we have now, according to the literature that's coming out, that the #1 killer in the United States is not cancer, which, by the way, has surpassed heart disease. Heart disease was always #1. Now cancer is moving up. But bigger than that is an illness called iatrogenic illness. Iatrogenic illness. Does anybody know what iatrogenic illness is? You know what it is, yeah. It's illness caused by modern medicine. Oops, I'm sorry, medicine. Side effects from drugs. Maybe 140,000 admitted people die every year. Malpractice, negligence. But we're talking about the #1 wiper-outer of people is that which we're supposed to get, reconciled.
On the radio this morning, the ex-health minister who was in Victoria said that kills 16,000 people in Australia each year too. So that's 8% of our population.
So how many people?
16,000.
In which? In
Australia.
In all of Australia.
Referring to our failing health system.
Yes. It's everywhere. I mean, anywhere you have heroic medicine. And again, what I'm saying, again, is I have no problems with modern medicine in terms of trauma and crisis medicine. But heroic medicine doesn't work when the food supply has gone up in smoke. And that's what's happening. We no longer live on our traditional foods. And if you have European relatives, the Europeans still have some contact with their traditional diets. You hear this story about the Mediterranean diet. And the people who write the books about the Mediterranean diet would have you believe that the Mediterranean diet consists of swimming pools of olive oil and no animal fat. I can assure you that that's not the case. Italian people and French people and Spaniards eat lots of animal fat in the form of dairy products or prosciutto, which is basically a ham from pigs that graze, if you want to call it that. wild in the chestnut forest getting fat on the nuts. And those boars are shot and taken into the abattoir, butchered there, and then put into the meat markets as fermented meat. There's a lot of seafood that's eaten, and there's a lot of fruits and vegetables, yes, that are eaten, and they do use olive oil. But they use a lot of other things. They use animal fat, and they do eat a lot of animal flesh. It's a very diverse, omnivorous diet. From soils, I might add, that have been farmed for thousands of years, and they're high calcium soils and volcanic ash soils that are quite capable of producing nutrient density in these foods. So anyway, back to this whole story. In 1999, the month that I was diagnosed, my cousin died of cancer. He got some kind of cancer that I wasn't even sure, because nobody seemed to be able to hook the connections together, but I heard about the fact that they now knew he had cancer in March of '99. By May, the month that I actually got the diagnosis, is the month that he died. So I lost a best friend about 2 years after that, in 2001 of November, from pancreatic cancer. And a year ago, I lost my female partner from breast cancer after 8 years, of which I was not involved in her life in the early days, but the last couple of years it was really amazing to watch somebody fight so hard and to go through what she went through and nevertheless not make it. You know, and the reason why I do this is because I realize we're losing way too many good people way before their time. I mean, we're all going to die. That's not the issue. But I don't think parents should bury their kids, for one thing. And sometimes we have to face that, but I think if it's unnecessary based on the fact that the modern medical machine, and that's what it is, it's an industry and it's a machine, is all predicated on the fact that nobody's really interested in solving the problem, merely making money off the fact that people are going to go lockstep to an oncologist, understandably because they're afraid. They've got a life-threatening illness. You know nothing about the illness, and I know what that's like from watching people I cared about go through it and not make it, as well as myself go through it, and I'm still here. And that brings me to the story that, you know, revolves around that particular time, which was in 1999. I knew something was wrong. I just didn't know what. And what I knew was wrong was that my immune system just wasn't itself. I just was too susceptible to colds, which turned into things like bronchitis, flus that would turn into these raging flus that would last 3 weeks instead of, you know, 3.5 days or 7 days. So I was starting to peel the onion in my own sort of way, and I got lucky, quote unquote, and I was in a car accident where I had a back injury that caused me to go to get an MRI. And in discovering that I had some disc problems with the back injury, I also found from the MRI that I had lymph nodes in my abdominal area, one as big as a fist, and a number of other ones that were several times larger than, quote unquote, normal. And then you get the call. You know something's wrong, you know you're going for an MRI, and then you get a call and you don't have any idea that this is the call. And it used to be in the United States, the 3 most powerful words you used to hear was, "I love you." And now the 3 most powerful words you seem to hear these days is, "You have cancer." Hung up the phone and I thought, yikes, now what? Something inside of me told me, okay, this is an opportunity to be humble, Jerry. You know what you think of the medical institution, but here's an opportunity for you to be humble. And I realized that I knew nothing about this illness. I knew nothing about non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And so I decided that what I needed to do was to prostrate myself in front of the high priests of high medicine by going to the oncologist and asking them, what do you know about this illness and what do I do about this illness? So I did. And I went to see 2 oncologists on the same day. And it was amazing. And I'm glad I went. I'm glad I ended up taking the time and allowing myself to go through that system to find out exactly what I was up against, because what I was really up against was abysmal ignorance. That's what I was up against. So I get to the oncology office, and the guy that met me, the oncologist, nice guy, big smile, short. And first thing was I sit down in the chair. He sits up on top of the desktop, looking down. Okay? So he starts to tell me, well, you know, you've got this large mass, and I said, so what is it you're suggesting I need to do? And he said, well, chemotherapy, and I'd say some pretty aggressive chemotherapy, like 30-odd treatments. And it's quite lucrative because the cost per treatment is like $1,700, $1,800 per treatment, times 30. And that's just the beginning. Well, I said, well, what is it you're going to use for chemotherapy? And again, keep in mind, I don't know too much about this stuff. All those things I told you about in the beginning of this talk, I've since read or watched or understood or learned. In the early days, on day one, I knew very little about what I now know. And he said, well, we're going to use two chemical cocktails. The first one we call MOP, M-O-P, and the second one we call CHOP, C-H-O-P. MOP and CHOP. They're acronyms for the chemicals that go into the cocktail. And I said, I notice they both have the letter P on the end. What's the P stand for? He said, well, we have to put prednisone in there, otherwise, because there's a very strong inflammatory response from these cocktails. And that's when I said, okay, first of all, I stood up. Now I'm looking down. I said, I want two things. I want to see the physician's desk reference, and I want the MSDS sheets. How many people know what MSDS sheets are? Material Safety Data Sheets. The MSDS sheets. Everybody's got to have them. I have to have them. I make botanical formulas for cows, and I have to have MSDS sheets. So I know with MOP and CHOP, there are MSDS sheets. Well, you want to put an oncologist back on his heels? Ask for the MSDS sheets. You want to put any kind of physician that's going to use any kind of medication on you, ask for the MSDS sheets. It's a good thing to ask because you'll get some very interesting disclosures in the MSDS sheets. Brings the MSD sheets back, and I read them. Major bone marrow destruction. And that's not surprising because you understand that malignancies are fast-growing cells, and these chemo agents are very effective at killing fast-growing cells. But there's two other groups of cells that are also fast-growing that suffer the consequence, i.e. collateral damage. Bone marrow is one of them. The other is the lining of the gut. The lining of the gut replaces itself in about every 5 days. That's how fast-growing the lining of the gut is. So that gets cooked. Damage to liver, damage to kidney, can cause anaphylactic shock, death. So I said, let me ask you something. I have to sign probably an indemnity statement, right? He said, yes. Holding you, the hospital, and the pharmaceutical companies completely harmless if I end up with injury or death, correct? He said, that's right. I said, that's a hell of a deal. What a deal. $1,700, $1,800 a treatment, and no matter what the hell happens to me, it's my fault. You know? Nobody's responsible for death or injury except me. So right away, I'm like thinking, logic, logic, logic. What's wrong with this picture? I can't imagine customers patronizing my services or products if I said, oh, just in case your cows drop dead or your horses drop dead from these supplements that we make, I'm totally not responsible at all. You're responsible for it. Can you imagine something like that? So I said, well, I tell you what, I actually brought a folder of information along that I'd like you to look at. And he said, what would that be? I said, well, actually, I've been doing some research since I heard about this diagnosis, and I've been doing some research on complementary medicine. And I said, and I selected the peer-reviewed literature, this kind of stuff that's published in the medical journals, not the stuff that's hanging on the bulletin board of the health food store. The medical literature on various kinds of protocols and supplements that were showing good promise. And I pushed it across the table to him, file about that thick, and he pushed it back across the table to me. And he said, "Oh, I know about that stuff." And I said, "Oh, you do?" And he said, yeah, I know about that stuff." He said, "You know, and you got to be careful with those herbs." And I said, "Excuse me?" He said, "Yeah, I heard this story just recently," and he started scratching his head about a woman who took an overdose of, what's that herb called? Echinacea? Echinacea? I said, "Oh, echinacea, the most commonly used herb in Western botanical medicine, used by everybody every day. Gazillions of doses taken every day. How many people died from echinacea? I'd like to see the MSDS sheet for echinacea compared to mop and chop." Well, things were getting a little bit flustered in this office by now. And he said, "Well, you know what, really, you have to go see the other oncologist, because really, I'm a tumor mass specialist. I remove masses. And since you have lymphoma, which is a lymphatic cancer, you need to deal with somebody who has the specialization of circulatory cancers like leukemia and lymphoma." So down the hall I go, but I know the call was made. Because by the time I got there, I know this guy got the call. "You got a live one coming, get ready." So I go in there, very stern, very grave, not at all friendly, happy guy. And I'm walking down the hall to go to the examination room with him and his resident assistant. And I'm looking in the rooms, and I see all these people hooked up to the chemo lines. It's quite compelling to see this. Sit in the room, and he's saying, "You know, you're a very foolish young man." And I thanked him for the compliment because I didn't think I was that young. And he said, "No, I'm serious. You're not being reasonable here, because you have a cancer that could kill you in 6 months, maybe 2 years, is all you have if you don't do something." I said, "Well, here's something that you need to know, because I've already checked with the Lymphoma and Leukemia Society's numbers, and this treatment can offer me a 35% survivability in 5 years. So I got a little over 1 chance in 3 of this thing working. And then at the end of 5 years, who the hell knows what? But the one thing I did find out is that if it comes back after the 5 years, good chance, and first of all, follicular cell lymphoma has got a notorious reputation of coming back within 5 to 10 years. And when it comes back, it oftentimes comes back as lymphocytic leukemia, which is much worse than non-Hodgkin's lymphoma to deal with. And if I died in the 6th year, they get the credit for success. Because if you make it to 5 years, you're a winner, even if you die in the 6th year. If you should die within that 5 years of complications like pneumonia, and many people who have cancer who are under these treatments die of cachexia or pneumonias and some other things. You didn't die of cancer. You died of something else. It doesn't go on the dark sheet. You're positive. So when you look at the statistics, what are they really telling you? Because they're cooked. The numbers are cooked. That much I know. More importantly, I found out in the Fortune magazine article that the longevity numbers that have been enhanced on some of the cancers have been enhanced based on earlier detection, which means if they found the cancer a year or 2 years earlier, you might have died the same date as you always died, but they throw those numbers not in the front, but on the back. And so they cook the numbers that way. Now this is in the article. I'm not making this up. This is what I read. And I also know it to be fact because I've asked people in the biz, in the business of cancer, that that's the way it works. So how many people really survive cancer? They don't have any cure for metastatic illness. That they admit. We're not dying from tumors. That they admit. We're dying of cachexia, 50% of us. That they admit. So what do they have to offer us? Now, what's interesting about this is that there's things that they could be doing in the conventional model that would make things a hell of a lot likelier to succeed. and less difficult for the patient. For example, number one, if you have an infection, and veterinarians do this all the time, veterinarians will culture the milk and they'll say, okay, there's an infection in here, it's a staph, it's a strep, or whatever it is. And what do? They can take it back and they could have it determined as to whether or not the antibiotic that they might recommend has any efficacy, that there's sensitivity there. They can do that kind of test for cancer to find out whether or not the chemotherapy they're going to use is actually going to be cytotoxic to the malignancy. And it's called Rational Therapeutics. It's a laboratory in Long Beach, California, headed up by Dr. Nigourney, Nigourney. Look it up on the web. Rational Therapeutics. And what do? They take a piece of the malignancy and they find out what kinds of chemo agents are going to be effective in killing the malignant cells. Because you can sure as hell bet they're going to kill the healthy cells. And if you're going to take a chemo agent, the last thing you want is to take a chemo agent that isn't going to kill the malignancies while it does kill the healthy cells. Because it is indiscriminate in terms of what it kills. There's another laboratory group in the United States that looks at the individuality of the malignancy, and it's called IMPATH. I-M as in Mary, P-A-T-H. It's on the web. And what they do is they look at the architecture and the biochemistry of your specific, unique to you cancer to find out what's really driving this. Are we talking about estrogen reception? Are we talking about this gene, that gene? What's actually going on at that level? So you can actually put together some strategies based on the discovery. Know thy adversary. And then there's this other therapy that they can use and are using in various clinics called IPT. Remember the story about insulin? Well, they found out that because insulin is the delivery system, I should say, of malignancies, that is, it delivers the glucose. When the insulin levels go up in the blood, cancer starts going into DNA synthesis and replication and division. It's starting to grow. So what do? They have this, and this medical practice was developed back in the 20s and it's being used quite successfully today. The cancer knows it's getting food, so it's going to go into the reproduction stage. You put insulin intravenously in the blood and then you administer the chemo at about 1/10 the normal dose and get a much higher kill of the malignancies with preferably the chemo agents that are efficacious against that malignant cell. Now, does that make sense? Isn't that reasonable? Isn't that scientifically plausible? Do they do that? No. They don't do that. On top of that, they load you up with morphine. They move the tumor. Instead of using drugs that are non-opiates, they use morphine. The last thing you want is morphine, because morphine suppresses natural killer cells, which are what? The immune system. For what? Metastasis. And so it increases metastasis and it tricks the body into believing, because when you're loaded with natural endorphins that come from the brain, your immune system's up and your body thinks everything's okay. When you're saturated with all the endorphins, because you ever hear that story that happier people or healthier people, they have stronger immune systems? That's why. Because happier people have high levels of endorphins. Endorphins do what? They raise natural killer cell activity. No, they put you on morphine and sugar and use chemo agents that they don't know whether they're even efficacious or not. Not to mention the fact that they got you on food that can't even be described as food according to Webster. So this is what I ended up going through. And when I finally ended up concluding the second visit, I said, finally, this visit's over. In fact, it was over before I walked in the room. I said, you know what really bothers me about this whole interview not once was I ever asked who I am. All I am to you folks is a malignant mass. That's all I am to you. You didn't ask me anything about me that separates me from any other person in that clinic out there. What I do for a living, what kind of food do I eat, what are my relationships like, what kind of stress I might have, do I exercise, do I smoke, do I drink? Nothing. It's just about malignancies and killing them with toxic mustard gas warfare and hoping that my body survives the assault and that I've got an immune system left. That's it. This is where we've come in the last 30 years of $200 billion. We spend $64 billion every single year to treat cancer patients, and another $14 billion annually to fund additional research, which according to the oncologists that were interviewed from the most prestigious hospitals of the conventional model say, what? It stinks? This is the best we have? It's bullshit. It's a holocaust, and there's no reason for it. And that's why what you folks need to do with your loved ones and yourselves when you deal with this is, first of all, recognize you're a human being, not a malignant mass. Number two, recognize you're the patron, you're the client, you're the goddamn customer. You're not somebody to be moved around like some pawn on a checkerboard that just happens to satiate, the fact that the high priest of medicine says this is what you got to do when he has nothing new to offer. Go to March 29th, Fortune magazine, if you can get it on the web, and download it. Read it and bring it to these people and say, these are your peers saying this. This isn't coming from the health food industry. This isn't coming from the quacks that you villainize. This is coming from people that are a lot more accredited in your profession than you are. Explain how this can be so. That's what you need to do. If we're going to start putting the brake on this insanity, we've got to start acting like we're a sovereign folk. We've got to start acting like the customer's king, because we are. And that's what hasn't been done. And understandably, because we're completely ignorant. But what I found out, like I said, the thing I really learned about is that the profession is abysmally ignorant. So the ignorance is breeding more of this, and we're walking home petrified, thinking, and if I don't do what he tells me to do, I'm cooked. You're not going to die in a week. The only cancers that really are runaway trains are the ones that are glioblastomas and pancreatic cancers, and pancreatic cancers can be something that lasts a year. Take a deep breath, start thinking about what you want to do, and recognize that there is no incompatibility with complementary care, and start finding out what the cause is behind the cause behind the cause. What causes cancer? And start dumping the junk that's aggravating the problem, because I can assure you it's probably deficiency of things that are essential, important, as well as excesses of things that you don't want or need, that are aggravating the cancer and will bring it back. Because until you neutralize that which caused it to begin in the first instance, by the time you get the diagnosis, things really have had to collapse. If what they say is true about the cell, every single cell having the ability to reconcile defective genes within 24 hours, 90% of the time, things really had to fall apart. Get off the sugar, get off the white flour and the carbs, start eating nutrient-dense foods, eat lots of good fat. I'll talk about some of this stuff when we go through the slides. And recognize that the future of medicine starts with this. I wouldn't be standing in front of you right here today, and I did a lot of things, and we don't have the time to go into all the blow-by-blows. The videotape has it. There's also some old interviews on acresusa.com where you can read, some of the things that I did, if you want to. But recognize that I wouldn't be here in front of you right now if it wasn't for the fact that the food is crucial. That the food is, there's no substitute for the food. I'm not saying that just by eating an apple a day, your cancer is going to go away. But I am saying that no matter what you do, and we'll go over some of the things that I did, that the nutrient density in foods are remarkable. as long as you start getting off of the stuff that really, in effect, creates a problem ongoing after you start getting on this regimen and this protocol. So, with that, we can go to, if I have the clicker. Oh. The food pharmacy or food as medicine? Sure, anytime. Jump in anytime you want. I did not look into Laetrile myself, but I had friends that used Laetrile, and they were using the intravenous form of Laetrile from the pharmacy in Mexico. I didn't have a lot of experience with Laetrile. I know there's been a lot of work done with Laetrile, and a lot of the research that was done actually was quite efficacious, although, again, things were cooked differently in the results, and Laetrile got demonized as being a fraud, when in fact, you can go to the Moss reports, M-O-S-S. Ralph Moss was a PhD associated with Sloan Kettering, Memorial Sloan Kettering in New York City. And he did the research and realized that the Laetrile research that was done there was quite legitimate. So the Moss Reports is a newsletter that you can get from Ralph Moss. He used to be, and I believe, I'm not exactly sure, but I believe he lost his daughter from cancer, which is why he became an investigative journalist about complementary medicine. And he looks at the stuff the way a scientist looks at it. He's not particularly partial to anything simply because it's alternative. He's looking for efficacy based on data and results. Yes?
Can you tell us what
Laetrile is a compound, they call it vitamin B17, and it's a compound found in the stone fruits, particularly the apricot pits where it's the highest, and it's a cyanide compound is what it is. But it's a form of cyanide that's bound molecularly in a way that the body doesn't suffer the consequences of cyanide as if it was a synthetic cyanide, and it's released apparently and uniquely to the cancer cells. Somebody else had a question.
Just a question on the sugars. You're talking about picking up sugars. Is there all sorts of sugars, or honeys and things like that, or just...
It depends. Naturally, the sugars, the question was, you know, what kind of sugars am I referring to? I'm talking about basically blood glucose, and if you are someone who suffers from hypoglycemia, hyperglycemia, then you really ought to take a look at your diet. Primarily what I'm focused on as being the villain is the refined sugars and the refined carbohydrates, which translate into sugar because they both generate insulin, and insulin is what makes you fat, not healthy fats. Insulin is the culprit that delivers all of these carbs. So what you need to find out is what is your fasting glucose. And if you look at the glucose numbers that are considered to be normal, you'll find out, and I'm not sure if these are American numbers or US numbers compared to Australian numbers. I know with cholesterol we use a different gauge number-wise. But with the numbers for glucose, we're looking at fasting glucose, healthy levels being somewhere like around 80 to 85, where you'll see the norm being 100 to 110. And that's just not going to cut it. They estimate that the Paleolithic diet, the hunter-gatherer diet, was between 60 and 85. Because there was no access to sugar other than food, fruits, and vegetables, period. And yet, you'll find out that a lot of people who are suffering from all these ailments, the sugar is a major issue because it's going to drive all these problems. Cardiovascular illness is going to be driven by sugar, that's for sure. All the inflammatory drugs, Vioxx, Celebrex, Bextra, where's inflammation coming from? There was another article that came out around the same time the Fortune magazine article came out, front page Time magazine, and it was basically the article had to do with the cause of all illness, in a word, inflammation. And then it went on as to how the drug industry was going to accommodate or try to accommodate our needs with anti-inflammatory substances, including Celebrex, Vioxx, and in fact, a lot of people who have cancer, they'll put on Celebrex because of the COX-2 inhibitor, which is this inflammatory enzyme, COX-2. Well, they know how the COX-2 cascade or pathway works. They know how it works. You have a pathway where you have essentially fats in the diet go down this way or they go down that way. The end product being anti-inflammatory leukotrienes or inflammatory ones, prostaglandins and so forth. They know what causes it. What causes it is insulin triggers it, and they know what puts the brake on it, which are the omega-3 fats. So we have a deficiency, a major deficiency of omega-3 fats. We have a major overabundance of omega-6 fats. You know what omega-6 fats are versus omega-3? They're both essential fatty acids. Omega-6 fats are the fatty acids that come out of grain. Omega-3 fats are the ones that ultimately originate from grass or algae, green stuff. And when you run it through animals, they turn it into the long-chain omega-3s. They call them DHA, EPA. And those are critical for health. They're called essential fatty acids because they are exactly that. You must have them to live and survive and to not have disease. The ratios are very critical. The ratios are going to be somewhere between 1 and 1 or 2 to 1 omega-6 to omega-3. That's what our target is. And not surprisingly, the Japanese have a body fat ratio of about 4 to 1 omega-6 to omega-3. The New Zealand Maori that still live on their native diets have a ratio, last checked, 2.8 to 1 of omega-6 to omega-3. Take a guess what the American body fat ratios are. 20 to 1. Omega-6 to omega-3. Now, I would bet a lot of the Australian body fats are very similar because you eat a lot of the same stuff we eat. Plus lots of insulin on top of the heap. So you want to know why you have inflammation? You have a deficiency of omega-3, you have a huge imbalance of omega-6 to omega-3, and you've got insulin. That's it. You want to stop the inflammation? Shut off the fountain. Turn it off. Or do the miracle pill stuff, which is take the Bextra, Celebrex, and Vioxx and roll the dice. Because it's not going to put out the inflammation. All it's going to do is symptomatically address discomfort. And that's why a lot of people take these things, because you get what? A quick response. And that's what we like. What do they call that? Instant gratification. You know? And we live with this myth that when you get an instant response, and I'm not saying there's not times we're going to take medication for instant response or gratification. When you have a pounding headache, there's nothing more distracting than that. Fortunately, since I've been on this month-long trip, I've only had one headache. And I stayed up all night trying to will it away, and it didn't go away. And I took an aspirin the next day, and aspirin to me is like heroin. Rarely take it. And just like that, it was gone. So no apologies for taking aspirin. But if I have to live on aspirin because there's something fundamentally awry in my system, I'm going to be concerned that if I don't take the aspirin, I'm going to be a miserable, cantankerous human being, and life is going to suck. Then that's not in my best interest, because I'm not really addressing why I'm feeling this way. I don't have an aspirin deficiency. And we have this myth, you know. It's the myth of modern medicine that a pill, you know, Mother's Little Helper from the Rolling Stones song, you know, Mother's Little Helper, pill, a magic pill, and then you get results. And that impresses us because we're Western in our thinking. We don't deal with the fundamentals. Well, the myth reminds me of the funny story about the two pilots that get on a plane. The plane is full of passengers in the back of the cabin. They're all waiting for the pilots, and finally they show up. And the two pilots walk up in the plane, and they've got their thick glasses on. They got the walking canes and two seeing eye dogs, right? So the whole cabin breaks out in laughter. This is a funny joke. Everybody's hysterical. The two captains walk into the cockpit. At the end of the runway, there's this huge body of water, a bay, saltwater body of water. And everybody on the plane knows that. And the plane's taking off down the runway, picking up, a lot of clicks. And people realize that they're pretty far along and the plane isn't lifting off. And then all of a sudden, all hell breaks loose with panic, cursing, praying, screaming and yelling. And then the last minute the plane's airborne, there's this huge sigh of relief. And everybody's, just collecting their wits. Meanwhile, flashback up to the cabin. You got Captain Bob and Captain Jim there. And Bob says to Jim, Jim, one of these days, those people back there are going to scream a minute too late and we're all going to die. And it's the myth, isn't it? It's this myth that they know what they're doing. They don't. And it's this myth that you don't know what you're doing. That is, those people didn't have a right to freak out, to scream and yell, because they find, rational thinking jumped into the scene saying, Bay, 300 miles an hour equals death. That's just instinct. And sometimes you got to follow your gut. You may not understand the prostaglandin pathway, but you know what you feel like. And don't ever ignore what you feel like, because your body talks to you. And if you don't feel right, and the only way you do feel right is masking the symptoms with palliative drugs, then that's exactly what you're doing. You're hiding from the underlying causes of what really is your true malaise. Back to the slideshow. Health comes from consuming full spectrum, nutrient-dense sustenance. That should be the definition of food. My comment about food is, if food is defined as that, then it heals you, does it not? Food is healing. It builds, it repairs, it allows a kid to grow into an adult. It allows a woman to go full term as a pregnancy and deliver a healthy child. That's all based on food. Food is either healing or it isn't. If it's not healing, what is it? It's killing you, right? There's no in between. It's like you're either pregnant or you're not, right? There's no in between. Either food is contributing to health and welfare and well-being, or it's not. And if it's not, it's doing the opposite. It's not neutral. Food's not neutral. So think about it in those terms. Every time you bite something, look at the ingredients, the hydrogenated fats, the vegetable oils that are loaded in rancid omega-6 fatty acids, the sugar, the refined salt, the food additives like, monosodium glutamate and the coloring. All of this stuff is not neutral. It's doing something. I think most of us think, a little bit, a little bit. The problem you have is, if you're not getting the nutrient-dense stuff, a little bit's a lot. You can do a little bit if you have the nutrient-dense stuff that buffers the little bit. But if you're not getting the bulk of your diet to provide the buffer, it's like agriculture. Those of you that are here today are talking about the basics, the foundations. What do you do when you build those foundations? You create an insular environment from extremes. You have a lot more ability to weatherproof the farm from flooding, from drought. There's buffers, built-in buffers. And nutrient-dense foods create the foundation to insulate you from, the insults. That's why we have livers. That's why we have kidneys. That's why we have bowels. That's why we have digestive enzymes. That's why we have lungs, elimination. And again, it's amazing to me that the insults that we have, and keep in mind, the insults that we have now, get this, we have 80,000 chemicals that have been released into the environment since the end of World War II that are all new. 80,000. And right now, the average British citizen is consuming, and I'm sure they don't consume any more than Americans do. This was a study that was released not too long ago. About a total of 20 pounds per year of food pesticides per person. Now throw the sugar in there, the food coloring, which is highly carcinogenic, and all these things. What astounds me, and then you've got the cocktail. Because what they don't know with the drugs and the chemicals that are in the environment, what they don't know is the phenomena known as negative synergy. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. We usually talk about that in terms of positive synergy. But with negative synergy, it's just the same thing, except not good. Example, you ever hear of the LD50 tests? LD50 is a lethal dose that will kill 50% of lab animals. That's why they call it LD50. And that's how they determine how toxic, or so they say, something is. Did you know they had an LD1 test? That is a lethal dose that will kill laboratory animals, 1% of them. So they gave a group of laboratory animals, I think in this case it was rats, an LD1 of lead, another group an LD1 of mercury. And then they put the two together, LD1 of mercury plus an LD1 of lead, and what do you think they got as a result? Which yours? 20. Any more guesses? 100. The perfect combo in that test. You see, so when you're taking these combinations at very minute doses, we don't know the outcome of all of these environmental contaminants, and then throw in all the drugs. That's why we're having a lot of side effects from drugs. It's not just the fact that one drug has a PDR list that you see on, do they advertise drugs on television over here now, like they do in the United States? No, well, we have like self-prescribing now in the United States, where drug companies market prescription drugs to the TV viewers so that you say, you know, I want to feel better. I've got this complaint, and if you have a responsible physician who says, I don't think that drug is really what is the issue with you, you know, we need some lifestyle changes, like some exercise, and maybe you need to lose a little weight and eat some food. No, I want this drug. And what happens if you insist on that drug and your physician doesn't give it to you? You're going to go to a doctor that will give it to you, aren't you? And the doctors all know this. And that's why the pharmaceutical companies make damn sure that those commercials stay on the air, because they self-prescribe. That's what it is, it's self-prescribing. And a lot of doctors, because they don't want to lose business, will accommodate the cantankerous customer, i.e. the uninformed patient. We get what we deserve. So, at any rate, I'm still on the first slide. Foods are medicines. Del Monte's a big fruit company, and they're big into tropical bananas and things like this. Well, you all know what pitted prunes are. I guess people here eat pitted prunes. And then you've got seedless raisins, and then Del Monte comes along with their package, and they were realizing, based on, well, what happened was back in about 1991, the National Institute for Health in the United States was embarrassed, you might say that, into coughing up a whopping $10 million toward an alternative medical division of the National Institute of Health. We spend billions on researching drugs, but they coughed up $10 million, and about every single year $10 million has been going into R&D, research, of foods and nutraceuticals and complementary medicine. So in the last decade plus, we've amassed somewhere between $300 million total research that's been going into foods, and so the food industry now is becoming, of course, excited about this, because the taxpayer is actually helping them investigate the medicinal properties of food that they can now legally put on the label. Well, notice what they call them now. Prunes, dried plums. Why do they call them dried plums? Changing the name. Because what? Prunes have that geriatric nursing home connotation. And we don't want to talk about that, right? Dried plums are the #1 antioxidant fruit, according to this study sponsored by the U.S. Department of Agriculture at Tufts University. And you can see that dried plums and raisins and blueberries and strawberries, and it's even got the seal of the American Heart Association. Boy, that's a food to eat. In fact, they found out, curiously enough, that athletes who consumed a couple of handfuls of plums and raisins before an event could actually make a dent in their performance times, because it mops up the lactic acid that causes muscle fatigue when you're working out, just eating food. And what's in these fruits and vegetables are basically the pigments. These are just a handful. You have lutein, which is what? It's the yellow pigment found in things like kale. It's also found in egg yolk, and it's very, very critical for macular degeneration issues. And we have an epidemic of macular degeneration. Isn't it interesting that we have an epidemic of macular degeneration because perhaps all of these people who are usually older have been spooked in the last 20-some years when they were middle-aged and now they're elders, not to eat what that has yellow? Eggs, which are really rich in lutein. Eggs, great food for lutein, particularly free-range eggs because the lutein primarily comes from the grass. All the pigments come from the grass, particularly the grass. Beta-carotene, anti-cancer precursor to vitamin A. Quercetin, one of the most powerful bioflavonoids that we can hope to get, and they're rich in all kinds of fruits like apples. Resveratrol, you hear about this one coming up. That's found in prunes and grapes. Excuse me, plums and grapes. Ellagic acid, lycopene, prostate, real important for the prostate. Tocotrienols, which are in the vitamin E family, found in the palm kernel, nuts and stuff. The proanthocyanidins, which are the blue pigments found in things like blueberries. And on and on. These are just a small sampling of them. Pigments are powerful. They're antiviral and antibacterial. As a matter of fact, you could probably take a handful of blueberries if you've got the runs, maybe 2 handfuls, and put it out. Literally. Because they're that strong. A couple of handfuls of blueberries if you've got the runs from maybe a bacterial whatever or a viral whatever. They work. Antioxidants, immune fuels, free radical scavengers. That's what that prune test or plum test that Del Monte was featuring. Free radicals. Those don't happen to be leftovers from the 60s politics. Free radicals are things that are damaging to the cell. And these are free radical scavengers. They're endocrine balancers. What are the endocrines? The hormone glands, right? The things that produce our hormones. And we've got a major problem with that because we have hypothyroidism, we have all kinds of xenoestrogens from the environment that mimic estrogen. We've got so many damn weird, screwed up hormones. No wonder why we don't know who we are anymore or what day of the week it is. Source of enzymes. They're detoxifiers. They repair tissue. These are very healing substances. Years ago, there was a book called The Grape Cure, and they talked about the vitamins in the grapes and the caffeic acid and the tannins. But now, they come out with this compound they've discovered, and this is what it's been getting a lot of hype in the last maybe 10 years, called the French paradox, which is what? The fact that the French eat supposedly, and this is of course a myth, all these foods that should cause cardiovascular illness. Well, first of all, that's a myth. All these high-fat foods don't cause cardiovascular illness. But let's assume that they did. You know, the point was that the resveratrol found in the wine, because it's found in the skin of the grape, is the reason why they've got such healthy cardiovascular systems. Actually, if you go to the Eskimos, you find out that they got the best cardiovascular systems on planet Earth, and they eat almost a pure fat diet because there's no apple trees up in Greenland or Siberia. And there's all kinds of evidence to show this, and that was published in the LA Times when I came home from Australia about a year ago. I picked it up, front page article, talking about people who lived up in the Arctic Circle and the fact that they're concerned about the contaminations they're getting from our industrial fallout, and these contaminants like mercury especially are climbing up the food chain. And that's interesting because mercury, doesn't seem to have an impact so much on the marine fish like it does on people. And the reason for it, they think, is because the marine aquatic life that are in the water, the fish, are able to sequester selenium out of the seawater. As the mercury levels go up, their consumption of selenium, which is an antidote to mercury, goes up. Something to be said for selenium, which I'll get into. But look at this stuff. These are phytoalexins. Phytoalexins are what? Those things that protect the plant from insect and disease attack. All these pigments that are wonderful for us are primarily made by the plant kingdom to keep the plant safe from insects and diseases. Blocks the progression of estrogen-related cancers. Boy, now that's significant. Inhibits what? Here's that word, metastasis. The University of Illinois Chicago says this might be the most potent substance they have found in any plant to deal with not only preventing cancers, but reversing cancers. This stuff right here, resveratrol. And you can buy it now in concentrated capsule form if you want to take high doses of it in addition to eating the food. Inhibits, even kills the development of cancer in all three phases: initiation, promotion, and progression. This is important. Against the development of amyloid beta protein deposits, Alzheimer's disease. Increases nitric oxide to relax blood vessels. What's that important for? The heart, and you don't have to worry about taking Viagra. Reduces abnormal blood clots, inhibits COX-2. There's the inflammatory, what? Celebrex, Bextra, Vioxx thing again. And this is interesting, 70% lower in grapes that are treated with fungicides. Something to be said for biological farming after all. Blueberries, one of my favorites. This is another study, USDA Human Nutrition Center, #1 rank in antioxidant activity versus 40 other fruits and vegetables. And you can see urinary tract infections, brain damage from strokes, macular degeneration. They found out about blueberries during World War II in terms of them having importance to vision, because the flyboys from the US worked with the flyboys of England, and they noticed that the British flyboys didn't suffer from night blindness like the American flyboys did. And the only thing that was different in their diet was the fact they ate a lot of blueberry preserves or jam every day. It's that tea time thing, I guess. I don't know what it is. Reduces LDL, prevents and reverses macular degeneration, and again, a very antiviral, antibacterial. Strawberries, #2, also the highest berry in vitamin C, and inhibits the oxidation of LDL. LDL is not a bad substance, it's the oxidation of the so-called bad cholesterol, which means what? You have a deficiency of antioxidants. High in folic acid. Raspberries, highest in this stuff called ellagic acid, which is one of the best things for squamous cell carcinoma in the throat, esophageal cancer. Coumaриc and ferulic acid, high in pectins, which naturally lowers your cholesterol. This thing with the cholesterol, folks, if you're on statin drugs, read up on it, because statin drugs are going to be the new plague of problems. And the reason why is because if it's true what they say, I don't understand why they would even want to prescribe statin drugs to reduce your cholesterol. And the reason for that is because 1 out of 2 people who have a heart attack have low cholesterol. So what are they getting heart attacks from? Try C-reactive protein, maybe homocysteine, viral loads, bacterial loads, and oxidized low-density lipoprotein, which is that lightweight cholesterol. Oxidized, meaning there's a lot of oxidation going on, meaning there's a lot of inflammation going on, which is relative to what again? Insulin, excessive amounts of omega-6, deficiencies of omega-3s, and deficiencies of the antioxidants, which are the pigments and the fat-soluble vitamins, which are all found in, by the way, particularly the main fat-soluble vitamins are found in fat, animal fat, fish fats, milk fats, lard from pigs on grass. That's where the fat-soluble vitamins are. We'll go into that. Cranberries. Bacterial anti-adhesion. Everybody knows about the importance of cranberry. I don't drink cranberry juice if you have a urinary tract infection because it's too much sugar in it. Get the cranberry concentrate. Better yet, use blueberries. It's even stronger than cranberries. But this is the berry richest in the phenolic compounds, which are very antimicrobial. And these phenolics are so powerful they're actually going to be making toothpaste with cranberry extract in it for gum disease. Apples. Apples a day. How many a day? Well, several times a week. 30% reduction in asthma in England. Very high levels of the bioflavonoid quercetin. It's an antioxidant bioflavonoid, and it's rich in trace elements, particularly selenium, which I hope to get to tonight. Sambuca, or the elderberry, In Italy, this is very popular. They make a sambuca tea or extract out of it for fevers and flu. And you can see this is a Norwegian study. There was another one done in Canada and a third one done in Israel that shows you can cut the flu incidence by 50% time duration by taking the sambuca elderberries. These are all legitimate peer-reviewed studies that have been done. Black cherry juice. If you got the gout, this is the stuff you want. And for teeth, block 89%, that's pretty impressive, of the enzyme activity causing tooth decay according to the Forsyth Dental Center in Boston, Massachusetts. Lycopene for the prostate, found in the tomatoes. The highest level on a dry matter basis is watermelon, higher than tomatoes. But tomatoes are easy to use because the lycopene is still very much there even when you cook it and make sauce out of it. And it's also found in grapefruits. If you're going to eat carbohydrates, eat your pumpkins. This is where you should get your starch, from your pumpkins. Why? They're loaded with the pigments and they don't have a glycemic index. They'll give you the energy that carbohydrates give you without making you fat, even with gobs of butter on them. That's what you want. Really healthy food. How many people know who Weston Price is? Sincerely, a few of you. Everybody ought to know about this work. This is some of the most significant work in human health that's ever been done, ever. And you've got chapters if you go to westonaprice.org. westonaprice.org. You have chapters all over Australia. It's an international organization. I'm a member on the steering committee of our local Pennsylvania chapter. And this guy was a Cleveland, Ohio dentist. And we have books back there on the table. And brochures are back there on the table that will give you some details on what this organization is. If you're a farmer, you want to see this organization thrive, because what this organization is doing is building connections between customers and people who produce these healthy foods, these medicinal foods. This man, and this is the story of what he did. The book is called Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, and it's an incredible photojournalism piece of work. He was a Cleveland, Ohio dentist that was tired of seeing all this lack of health in his patients. A lot of cavities, a lot of bad teeth and gum disease, also other degenerative illnesses. And so he took it upon himself to travel around the world in the 30s at a time that no longer exists. And what I mean by that, he went to these very isolated communities that he knew were still living with their indigenous traditional foods. He wanted to find the healthiest people in the world. He even came to Australia and researched some of the Aboriginal populations back in the 30s, and the Maori in New Zealand, Central America, South America, the Arctic Circle, the Alps of Switzerland, the Outer Hebrides Islands of Scotland, everywhere. And he did this at a time, like I said, that doesn't exist anymore, because at that time some of these people were living strictly on their native traditional diets, while some of their neighbors who lived down the road, therefore living in the same geography and had basically the same genotype, that is of the same race, were trading with the West and starting to eat processed foods. And he could compare the difference in their health at that which happened in a short period of time. And one of the things he found out, the protective factors, the real protective factors translated, now we're talking in the 30s, this was a 10-year study. There's where he analyzed, you see all those groups up there, from the Eskimos down to the Africans and everybody in between. And what he found out is that across the board, people on their native diets who were incredible examples of health. They had longevity, they had no huge incidences of early childhood death, they had strong teeth without cavities, they didn't have degenerative illnesses. All of them, wherever they were, that were really a picture of health, all of them had diets that were consuming 5 times more minerals than Western counterparts were in the 30s. Now, if you saw some of the slides I had up today showing you how the mineral levels have been dropping in our soils and in our foods, according to the United States Department of Agriculture, since the 40s and the 60s. It's astounding. And this was in the 30s. The other thing is, maybe just, if not more important than that, is they all consumed on the average 10 times more fat-soluble vitamins, which are what? Vitamin A, D, E, and K, than their Western counterparts. And that's when he started putting the pieces together and connecting the dots. It didn't matter where you were. They all ate high levels of animal fats, of animals that lived off the land, not feedlot beef, not feedlot dairy or feedlot pork or feedlot chicken. Animals that were out eating their native foods as well, plus fish if they were in a situation where certainly the people up in the Alps were not eating fish. And people that were living in the Polynesian islands were not eating dairy products. They were all eating various versions of fat, animal fat, and then lots of minerals taken in from varieties of foods indigenous to that area. It didn't matter where it was. None of them ate grain unless it was fermented or it was sprouted. That was another thing. And they ate a lot of fermented foods, and I'll go into why. Now, these are foods that are high in vitamin D, and vitamin D is an incredibly crucial element to stay well and get well. Vitamin D, if it was discovered today, would not even be called vitamin D because it's technically a hormone. It's called cholecalciferol. That's the word. And if you look at the top, what's the top food? Eel. Who eats eel? Your mother ate eel today? All right. Is she Japanese? Oh, you caught one and ate it. Eel. And which race of people eat a lot of eel?
Dutch.
The Dutch? Okay, the Dutch. The Japanese are probably the biggest eaters of eel. Very big in their diet. And sardines, they're up there. Red salmon, I got a few of them up there. This list goes on and on. But these are extremely concentrated sources of vitamin D. Where do you get vitamin D from? Can you get it from veggies? Nope. Can you get it from fruits? Not a chance. Where can you get it? You can get some from the sun if you have cholesterol in your system. That's the trick, right? But how many people are out in the sun these days? Everybody's running from the sun. A lot of people run from the sun, particularly urbanites. A lot of people who end up with these skin cancers are people who rarely go in the sun. They're under fluorescent light bulbs all day in offices. And they go in their car and they drive home and under artificial light at home in front of a computer screen or a television set. A lot of people don't get sun because they're afraid of what? Skin cancer, which is really associated with some other deficiency. And that's been published in the literature. It's a fat-soluble vitamin also called vitamin A. We have an acute vitamin A deficiency in our culture. Where do you get vitamin A from? You get it from veggies? No, I know you're going to say you do beta-carotene. Beta-carotene is pro-vitamin A, and it's a wonderful pigment, but it has to be converted by the body into long-chain vitamin A. It's not nearly as efficient in doing that, but it's a good substance, vitamin A, from beta-carotene and these other carotenoids. Vitamin A primarily comes from animal foods. That's where it comes from. Animal foods, the kind that your body craves. Same with the essential fatty acids. And then we have the omega-3 fatty acids. These are the long chain, what we call DHA, EPA. And what's the number one up there? Roe of fin fish. What is roe? Eggs. Yeah, caviar. Eggs, fish eggs. That's where the omega-3 fatty acids are. Red salmon, you can see a whole lot of mostly fish in there. The omega-3 fats are the ones that are the anti-inflammatory raw materials for this whole thing that people are struggling with. We're not getting enough of these. This also delivers, the vitamin D is important because the vitamin D ionizes the calcium. Can't get calcium in the blood unless you have vitamin D. And if you don't get calcium in the blood, you can't get all these other things that go with calcium. It's a delivery system of all the other minerals. And vitamin D is in the small intestine, and you need boron in the diet in order to activate it. Because the parathyroid gland, which regulates blood calcium, also needs magnesium and boron. So all these minerals, here we are, minerals and fats containing fat-soluble vitamins all work together to make sure the cell gets optimally nourished and protected. Every single cell in the body, without exception, has vitamin D receptors. And it's a powerful substance for a condition that's necessary for cancer to go away called apoptosis. Apoptosis, that's cell death of the malignancy. Cell dies. Apoptosis is dependent upon vitamin D being adequately in the body. Okay? Remember that. And where are you going to get it? You got to get it from like cod liver oil and these foods. Get some sunshine. If you're worried about the ozone, take vitamin A. Where do you get that? Well, it just so happens to be that good cod liver oil, which you can now get lemon flavored so it doesn't taste like, a fish anymore, has vitamin A and vitamin D. And the Carlson's brand has the essential fatty acids in it. So you can get vitamin A, vitamin D, and the EPA, DHA, all in one nice tablespoon. And then go out in the sun and get a tan. And smile. Vegetables of the cross, the cruciferous vegetables. Really profound vegetables here. And these are the family of them. You know them all. Broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, kale, rutabagas, turnips, cabbages. Here's what they're saying about this. These are just a few endorsements. There's many more. The anti-cancer compounds, diothiones, flavonoids, isothiocyanates, indoles, phenols. The number one vegetable in protecting against cancer, according to University of Minnesota, State University of New York at Buffalo, Johns Hopkins, and the National Cancer Institute. Stimulates the production of antibodies. It's a powerful detoxifier. Produces that wonderful compound called glutathione, which detoxifies the liver and augments the immune system, because when glutathione comes in contact with what? Selenium, you make strong immunity against what? Cancer. Enzymes that attach to glutathione. Affects cancers of colon, rectum, esophagus, larynx, prostate, bladder, and now the female cancers. Finding out, and I'll go through this in a little bit here, if I would get it to work. There it is. Eating cruciferous vegetables. Just eating several times a week. University of Hawaii. 1,600 men. This is over about a decade of time. Cut prostate cancer risk 40%. Cut colorectal cancer by 50%. Harvard University. Bladder cancer is cut by 50%. Vanderbilt University. 50% reduction in breast cancer. Yes?
Just a query on cooking or lack of cooking or cooking.
The type of cooking it?
Impact on disease.
That's a very good point, and I'm going to get to that right coming up. I'm glad you brought it up, because one thing about the cruciferous vegetables is they are goitrogenic, which means they can suppress the thyroid if eaten in high quantities raw. So you're better off steaming them or something like that, but better than that, you're better off fermenting them, and we're going to get to that here in a bit, because fermenting the cruciferous vegetables not only gives you all of the benefits of the vegetable itself, it gives you all of the added benefits of fermentation. Fermenting foods, that's one of the things that Weston Price found out. Fermenting foods opens up a whole new door of adding value and medicinal value, strong medicinal value to foods. Fermentation compounds, I'll show you what a few of them are. But this is the kind of thing, imagine if a drug company came out, folks, and said, we've got a drug, a pill, and if you take this pill once or twice a week, you'll cut prostate cancer by 50%, or you'll cut breast cancer by 50%, or you'll cut colorectal cancer by 40%. If they came out and said that this drug has been proven to do this by taking it once or twice a week, what do you think their stock on Wall Street would do? How many people do you think would be lining up to buy that drug that will do what that just those foods do? Millions of people would be doing that. And yet, does anybody, it's like Rodney Dangerfield. They get no respect. The foods get no respect. Remember Rodney Dangerfield, the stand-up American comic? That was one of his favorite lines. I get no respect. Well, the foods get no respect. And if you ferment them, kimchi, sauerkraut, the chutneys and the relishes that are fermented, These foods are powerful because now you've got all of the chemistry of the plants, plus now you've got fermentation. And what's in fermentation? Basically, you're making silage. I tell farmers when they're making silage, you're making kraut. I tell people when they're making kraut, they're making silage. It's lactofermentation. What does lacto mean? Lactobacillus, lactic acid, organisms that produce lactic acid, lactofermentation. And here's what you get when you ferment something. You get lactic acid, which is a powerful growth inhibitor of pathogens. You get benzoic acid, which is a growth inhibitor that the food industry uses for preservative. You get this incredible substance, an enzyme called lactoperoxidase, which wipes out pathogens like Salmonella, Listeria, Campylobacter, and E. coli. They don't live in this stuff. You have an antibiotic called niacin, N-I-C-I-N, which now pharmaceutical companies are trying to synthesize, being that they discovered it in lactofermented foods, to use as an intramammary infusion for mastitis up the udder of cows, because they don't have to throw the milk away because there's no antibiotic residue. You have another antibiotic called acetylene. You have this stuff called hydrogen peroxide. Everybody knows what that is and why. And then you got loads and loads and loads and loads of things that we're all critically deficient on called enzymes. And we're all really deficient in enzymes. And enzymes are the key of food, because if you eat processed foods and you cook them, you destroy the enzymes. And what's the significance of the enzymes? Well, for one thing, it helps you absorb nutrients. What you eat is one thing. What you get into the cell through the bloodstream is a whole nother ball of wax. And if you've got compromised digestion, and if I were to take a poll in this room, I know, if it was honest, I'd find as many hands go up in this room as I would anywhere else. Lots of people have lousy digestion. It's maybe the number one or number two over-the-counter medication that's sold in the United States after over-the-counter painkillers is antacids and digestive malaise supplements. And that isn't what you want, because if your digestion is compromised, what's happening? You're not absorbing nutrients, because hydrochloric acid in the stomach, which is very acidic, is what allows you to absorb trace elements and what thoroughly starts to break apart proteins. And if they don't start to break down properly in the upper gut, here's what happens. It starts moving south and you get fermentation, the wrong kind, because this was too weak. Now you start getting distension, and as the gullet starts to distend, it starts to ferment and it starts putting pressure on the esophageal entry, which means you get this thing when you lie down called what? Reflux. And it's not coming mostly from an excess amount of stomach acid. It's coming mostly from a deficiency of stomach acid and an excess of foul fermentation acids that are backing up. Then what do? First thing, antacids, right? What are the antacids made out of? They're made out of either calcium or aluminum hydroxide, which what? Neutralize the acid, which is really a bunch of weird fermented stuff. And oftentimes you can tell this when you're in the company of people who have poor digestion. It's where bad breath comes from, not the mouth a lot of the time. It's coming from this down here, because this stuff is now doing a different kind of a digestion, which ain't pretty. You take the antacid, neutralizes all the acid, including the hydrochloric acid that's secreted from the gut, sends a signal to the brain, this man just ate a full dinner. Why? Because when you eat a full dinner, what happens? You absorb all the hydrochloric acid. So the message goes to the brain, he overate. So we need more acid, thank you. And so the body starts going into production to produce more HCl, which does what? You take another antacid. After years of this, you can't produce enough hydrochloric acid. And now you're going to not absorb zinc, which is really critical, and iron, which is really critical, and selenium, and chromium. And now what happens? All those enzymes that are associated with those kinds of things, what's iron associated with? Strong immunity against viral infections, because it's the trace element associated with white cells producing hydrogen peroxide. You know? And then you end up now with lower gut stuff. How many people saw the picture of the intestinal villi this morning? You know? Okay. Remember we got a thing called the leaky gut syndrome? Everybody ever hear of leaky gut syndrome? Also known as dysbiosis. Lots of it out there. Now you've got stuff that's in the small intestine, and it ain't good stuff. And it's causing a lot of other secondary fermentation down here. So you got gas coming out the top, gas coming out the bottom, constipation, diverticulitis, Crohn's disease, irritable bowel syndrome, all of these things, all because we're taking all these things to shut off digestive enzymes. One of the best ways to clean this act up is start eating foods like this, start taking digestive and food enzymes with every meal. You may have to take hydrochloric acid supplements and ox bile supplements to deal with all the deficiency you have in order to eat protein again and fat again. And that's what I would do. That's what I do when I'm on the road. I bring in an extra stomach just for me. Because one thing that's for sure is, if you want to get rid of infections or prevent yourself from getting infections, and if you don't have strong acid in your stomach, that's where you break down these infectious agents called parasites. This is applicable to people, and it's applicable to sheep, it's applicable to cattle. That's where you deal with parasites, because what are parasites primarily composed of? Protein. What are bacteria primarily composed of? And viruses? Protein. You need things that break apart protein up here. And so if you neutralize the acids that break down protein, not only are you not getting proper protein digestion and assimilation, you're creating environments that are breeding weird organisms. And then end up with this whole cascade of mineral deficiency because you can't absorb the minerals unless it starts up here. And these are the kinds of foods that you need in order to improve digestion, clean out the gut, because no weird organisms that are pathogenic will live in this stuff. And you can do this with milk products, you can do it with meat, and you can do it with vegetables, and you can do it with just about anything. It creates a whole other pre-digestion. Yes?
Jerry, where does water fit in? We often hear you shouldn't drink after half an hour before a meal, or
That's
3 hours after a meal.
Yeah, she brought up the question, where does water fit into this in terms of drinking right after you eat or while you're eating? You're right, I rarely drink a lot of water. I can tell that if I drink a lot of water, it doesn't do me a lot of good when I'm eating a lot of food. I do drink some red wine though when I'm eating a meal, and that seems to help. No problem. It's not water, it's a ferment. You know, wine is really a ferment, isn't it? It's a ferment. So I drink red wine oftentimes when I eat, and I don't think you should drink a lot. If you're really thirsty, drink first, wait a little while, then eat, and wait a little while. Right. Mm-hmm.